What if everything you've been taught about vampires was a lie? What if they weren't just creatures of myth, but a hidden part of history, waiting to be uncovered? The question lingered in Ethan Hale's mind like a whisper he couldn't ignore. He sat at his desk in the dimly lit library, surrounded by piles of ancient books and manuscripts. The air was thick with dust, the kind that settles over time on forgotten truths. Ethan's fingers trembled as he turned the brittle pages of a centuries-old text, one that promised answers to the mysteries he had spent years chasing. For most people, vampires were nothing more than stories, fables passed down through generations to frighten children. But for Ethan, these were not just fairy tales. His obsession with history, particularly the darker, hidden parts, had led him to a singular, unshakable belief. Vampires were real. He had spent countless hours in libraries, archives, and forgotten tombs, trying to piece together the truth. He had studied the tales of Vlad the Impaler and Elizabeth Báthory, of creatures lurking in the shadows of ancient civilizations. Each account had led him to one conclusion. The vampire myth was far more than a legend. It was a history veiled in darkness, waiting to be rediscovered. Tonight, as the weight of the manuscript pressed into his hands, Ethan felt something shift in the air, as if the walls themselves were closing in, urging him to keep reading. The manuscript, written in an ancient language he barely understood, spoke of an order, one that claimed to have witnessed the rise and fall of vampires through the ages. It described their origins, their rise to power, and, eventually, their decline. But what caught Ethan's attention wasn't just the history. It was the warning embedded within the text. A warning that the vampires were not gone, not eradicated, but hiding in plain sight, biding their time. And now, the time had come for their return. As Ethan read on, he could feel the unease settle deep in his chest. He was no longer just an observer, he was a part of this story. The discovery he had just made was the key to unlocking a truth so dangerous. It could destroy everything he thought he knew about the world. The truth about vampires, it seemed, was only the beginning. Ethan sat back in his chair, the manuscript still open before him. His heart raced with excitement, but there was a growing unease gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Could this really be true? Vampires, the ancient creatures of darkness, still existed? If so, what did that mean for the world as he knew it? His mind wandered back to the warning he had read earlier in the text. The time for their return is near. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that this was no longer just an academic pursuit for him. This was something much bigger, something that could change everything. With a determined breath, Ethan closed the manuscript and stood up. The air in the room felt heavier now, charged with an energy he couldn't quite place. His fingers brushed the edge of the table, and he looked around at the stacks of books that surrounded him. The truth was out there, waiting to be found, and he had just found the first clue. Ethan's eyes settled on an old map pinned to the wall. It was a map of Eastern Europe, a region rich in vampire lore. His finger traced the route from Transylvania to the Balkans, stopping at several key locations tied to famous vampire legends. Vlad the Impaler's castle, the crypts of the ancient vampires, and then there were the less-known places, the towns and villages where the stories were still whispered in hushed tones. He had to start his search there. The first step would be to find any living descendants or secretive groups who had guarded these vampire secrets over the centuries. But where to begin? Ethan's research had pointed to a hidden society, an order known as the Brotherhood of the Eternal Night. According to the manuscript, they had been the keepers of vampire history, and they knew the truth about the rise and fall of these creatures. They were not simply scholars, they were protectors or perhaps even worshippers of vampires. He quickly gathered his things, grabbing a leather journal, a few reference books, and a map of Romania. His next destination was clear, but before he left, he paused and glanced at the manuscript one last time. His eyes scanned the final pages, which had been partially torn. Something was missing. There had to be more to this story. He felt it deep inside, an instinct that told him the manuscript was only the beginning. The truth he sought was still out of reach. The flight to Romania was long, and Ethan couldn't shake the sense that something was watching him. It wasn't just the unease that had come over him after reading the manuscript. It was a primal feeling, a sensation that had gnawed at him ever since he stepped into that musty library. But he pushed it aside. He had a mission now, and he would see it through. Upon landing in Bucharest, the weight of the world seemed to press down on him. Romania was steeped in history, but it was the kind of history that was both beautiful and terrifying. The medieval castles that dotted the landscape were reminders of an age when myths and monsters roamed freely. There was a palpable sense of the supernatural here, especially in the Carpathian Mountains, where the stories of vampires had begun. Ethan had arranged to meet a local historian, a woman named Alina, who was rumored to have knowledge of the Brotherhood of the Eternal Night. He had heard of her through obscure references in the text he had studied, and her reputation as a scholar of vampire lore was both renowned and feared. Alina's office was tucked away in a small alley in the heart of Bucharest. The building itself was ancient, its stone walls covered in creeping ivy. As Ethan entered, a strange silence filled the air, and he couldn't help but feel as though he had crossed into a different world. A world where vampires were not just myth, but very much alive. Alina, a tall woman in her early 30s, greeted him with a piercing gaze. She was dressed in dark clothing, her eyes sharp and calculating, as if she had already assessed him and his purpose before he had even spoken. "I know what you're here for," she said, her voice calm but edged with something darker. "And I warn you, Ethan, some truths are better left undiscovered." Ethan swallowed hard, the gravity of her words sinking in. This wasn't just a history lesson anymore. This was real. Alina led Ethan through a narrow hallway, the walls lined with bookshelves filled with ancient texts and manuscripts. The dim lighting cast long shadows, and the scent of old paper and incense filled the air. As they reached the end of the hallway, Alina opened a heavy wooden door and motioned for Ethan to enter. Inside, the room was stark and unsettling. The walls were covered in intricate carvings of symbols that Ethan couldn't recognize. Symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. At the center of the room stood a large stone table, surrounded by candles that flickered with an unnatural glow. It was a place that felt both sacred and forbidden, and Ethan's heart raced as he stepped inside. "Welcome to the Brotherhood's sanctum," Alina said, her voice low and reverberating through the room. "This is where our knowledge is kept, where we protect the secrets of the vampires, secrets that have been passed down for generations." Ethan's eyes scanned the room, taking in the strange artifacts and ancient tomes that surrounded him. It was clear that the Brotherhood had been preserving knowledge about vampires for centuries. But what kind of secrets did they truly guard? And why had they chosen to remain hidden from the world? "You're here because you want the truth," Alina continued, her gaze steady on him. "But I warn you, Ethan, there are things you cannot unlearn. Once you see what's hidden in the darkness, you cannot unsee it. Are you prepared for that?" Ethan nodded, his resolve unshaken. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. Alina walked over to a large, ancient book that lay open on the stone table. Its pages were worn and fragile, but the text inside seemed to glow with an eerie light. She turned to a specific page and motioned for Ethan to come closer. "This is the story of the rise and fall of vampires," she said, her voice growing more serious. "It begins in the ancient world, in the cradle of civilization, where the first vampires were born. They were not always the bloodthirsty creatures of myth. They were once gods, beings of immense power who walked among humans. But as their power grew, so did their hunger." Ethan leaned in closer, captivated by the ancient text. He had always believed that vampires were just creatures of legend, but here, in this room, he was learning something completely different, something far more sinister. Alina continued, "The vampires were once rulers, revered and feared by all. They controlled the fates of kingdoms, and their immortality was their greatest weapon. But power corrupts, and their insatiable hunger for control led to their downfall. They became too powerful, too arrogant, and their own creation, the Brotherhood, rose up to overthrow them. Ethan's mind raced. This was the beginning of something much darker than he had ever imagined. The Brotherhood, it seemed, was not just a group of scholars. They were protectors of humanity, the ones who had fought to keep the vampire's power in check. Why are they still around? Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of the knowledge he was uncovering. Because the vampires never truly died, Alina replied, her eyes narrowing. They've always been here, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. The Brotherhood has kept them at bay, but now, the time is approaching when the vampires will rise again. And she paused, looking directly into Ethan's eyes. We must be ready. Ethan felt the gravity of her words settle over him like a weight. His search for knowledge had led him here, to the heart of the Brotherhood. But what he was discovering was far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. The vampires were not just creatures of darkness. They were an ancient force, one that had shaped the course of history and was now poised to return. As Ethan left the Brotherhood's sanctum that night, his mind was swirling with questions. What would happen when the vampires returned? What role would he play in this ancient conflict? It was then that he saw something in the distance, a figure standing under the pale moonlight. A woman, dressed in dark, flowing clothing, her features sharp and otherworldly. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he realized who it was. It was a vampire. The figure stepped closer, and for a moment, Ethan felt a strange pull, as though the vampire was calling him, drawing him in with an invisible force. He instinctively stepped back, but his curiosity kept him rooted to the spot. Don't be afraid, the vampire spoke, her voice soft yet commanding. I have been watching you, Ethan Hale. You seek the truth, and I can give it to you. Ethan's pulse quickened. His instincts told him to run, to escape, but he was paralyzed by the vampire's presence. She was no longer just a creature of myth. She was real, standing before him, offering him a choice that would change everything. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as the vampire stepped closer, her eyes glowing in the moonlight. The air around them seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and for a moment, everything felt surreal, like the world had tilted and he was no longer in control of his own fate. You're real, Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the situation, but it was all too much. Vampires were supposed to be myths, legends woven into the fabric of history. But here, before him, was undeniable proof. The vampire smiled, a faint curl of her lips that seemed almost sad. Of course, we are real, but the world has forgotten us. Your kind has forced us into the shadows, erased our history. Now we are preparing to reclaim what was once ours. Ethan's mind reeled. The history of vampires, which he had studied for so long, was now taking on a terrifying new dimension. The truth was more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined. Why me? Ethan asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Why are you revealing yourself to me? The vampire's eyes gleamed with something like amusement. Because you seek the truth. You are not like the others, Ethan. You are searching for answers, even when those answers might destroy everything you know. She paused, studying him carefully. You have a choice now. Join us and you will see the world as it truly is. You will understand the full power of the vampire legacy and the role you can play in it. Or, you can walk away. But know this, once you make your choice, there is no turning back. Ethan took a step back, his breath shallow. This was the moment he had feared. He had always sought the truth, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. The idea of becoming part of the vampire world, of aligning himself with the creatures he had studied, both terrified and enticed him. I don't want this, he said, his voice cracking. Even though part of him was drawn to the vampire's offer, It was a power unlike anything he had ever felt. But at the same time, he knew the consequences. Joining them meant losing his humanity, becoming something else, something dangerous. The vampire's expression softened, and she stepped closer, her voice low and persuasive. "You don't have to fear us, Ethan. We are not the monsters you've been told about. We are the forgotten rulers of the world, the ancient ones who once commanded empires. We are the ones who hold the key to immortality." For a moment, Ethan's resistance faltered. He had always been drawn to the unknown, to the hidden truths of history, and now he was standing on the precipice of something unimaginable. The promise of immortality, of knowledge beyond human comprehension, was tempting. But then, as if something deep inside him shifted, Ethan remembered the warnings. The Brotherhood had told him that vampires had once been gods, beings of immense power who were brought down by their own greed and hunger. He could not let himself be a part of that. "No," Ethan said, more firmly this time. "I won't join you. I came here to uncover the truth, but not like this." The vampire's eyes flickered with something darker, a flash of anger or disappointment, but then her features softened. "So be it, Ethan Hale," she said, her voice tinged with a trace of respect. "You are stronger than most, but know this, your search for the truth has only just begun. The Brotherhood will not protect you forever, and the vampires will not be denied. We will return, and when we do, you will be faced with a choice far greater than the one you have made tonight." With a final, lingering look, the vampire turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ethan standing alone in the moonlight. His heart still raced, and the weight of her words settled heavily on his shoulders. The next few days felt like a blur to Ethan. He returned to the Brotherhood's sanctuary, but the once familiar place now felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around him. The vampire's words echoed in his mind, and every corner of the world seemed filled with a sense of impending doom. He had made his choice. He had turned down the vampire's offer, but the consequences were far from over. He knew that he had only scratched the surface of something much darker, and the vampires were not going to let him walk away so easily. As he sat in the dimly lit library, going through his research, Ethan began to connect the dots. The Brotherhood's warnings had been clear. There were ancient forces at play, and the vampires were preparing for a resurgence. The world was on the brink of something catastrophic, and Ethan realized that he was at the center of it. But what could he do? He was just one man, armed with knowledge and a burning desire to uncover the truth. The vampire's offer had been tempting, but he knew he couldn't join them. But at the same time, he couldn't walk away from this. The fight was inevitable, and so Ethan prepared himself. He would need to find a way to stop the vampire's return. But first, he had to understand their true power, their weaknesses, and the ancient secrets that could defeat them. The time for research had passed. Now it was time to act. As the sun set on the horizon, casting a blood-red glow across the sky, Ethan felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The storm was coming, and he was about to be swept up in it. Ethan's mind was racing. The vampire's words, her offer, the warning. It all circled in his thoughts like a storm. He had rejected her, but something told him the danger was far from over. The Brotherhood had warned him that the vampires were not simply myths. They were a force that had shaped history, a force that was ready to rise again. But how could he stop them? He needed more than just knowledge. He needed a way to fight them, to weaken their power before they could take back what they had lost. Late that night, Ethan stood in front of the Brotherhood's vault, his hand resting on the cold metal door. Inside, the answers he needed were hidden. Ancient texts, rituals, and knowledge that had been passed down through generations. The Brotherhood had kept these secrets for a reason, and Ethan wasn't sure he was ready for what lay inside. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was filled with books, scrolls, and relics from centuries past. But it wasn't just the historical artifacts that drew him in. It was the hidden knowledge, the forbidden texts, the ones that had been locked away from the world for a reason. Ethan found the book he was looking for. An ancient tome bound in black leather, its pages cracked with age. The title was written in a language he couldn't understand, but he knew it was the key. As he opened the first page, he was struck by a symbol he recognized. A blood-red crescent moon, surrounded by strange runes. The same symbol that had been etched into the walls of the Brotherhood's sanctum. He ran his fingers over the page, trying to decipher its meaning. The text was old, older than anything he had encountered, but he could feel the power emanating from it. This was no ordinary book. It was a guide to the rituals of the vampires, their origins and their power. Ethan felt the weight of the knowledge he was about to unlock. The pages spoke of an ancient vampire queen, a being of unimaginable power who had ruled over the vampires for centuries. She was said to have been destroyed, but her legacy lived on, and her bloodline was the key to the vampire's resurrection. If Ethan could find this bloodline, he might be able to destroy the vampires for good. But how could he find someone who had been lost to time? How could he track down a bloodline that had been hidden for centuries? As Ethan read further, he discovered that there was a way to find the last living descendant of the vampire queen. The ritual was dangerous, requiring a rare artifact, one that could be found only in the crypts beneath the ancient city of Prague. Ethan didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. The journey to Prague would be perilous, but the artifact he needed to complete the ritual was too important to ignore. It was the only way to find the vampire queen's bloodline, and with it, the key to stopping the rise of the vampires. The flight to Prague was long and uneventful, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He had the knowledge, but now he needed to act on it. The crypts beneath Prague were rumored to be haunted, a place where the dead had been buried for centuries, and where dark secrets were kept hidden. As he arrived in Prague, the city seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't explain. The cobblestone streets, the ancient buildings, the mist rising from the river. It all felt like something out of a nightmare, but Ethan knew that he had no choice. He had to find the artifact. He had to find the key. Ethan made his way to the crypts, descending into the depths of the earth. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and decay. As he walked through the narrow corridors, he felt as though the walls were closing in around him. The further he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. At the heart of the crypts, Ethan found what he was looking for. An altar, ancient and weathered, with the artifact resting upon it. The artifact was a small, intricately carved stone, shaped like a crescent moon, with runes etched into its surface. It pulsed with an eerie energy, and as Ethan picked it up, he felt a cold chill run through his body. It was the key to finding the vampire queen's bloodline. But as he turned to leave, he heard a sound, soft, echoing footsteps behind him. He spun around, heart racing. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. A man with piercing red eyes, a smile that sent shivers down Ethan's spine. "You found it," the man said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "But now you must pay the price." The man in the shadows stepped forward, his footsteps deliberate, echoing in the silent crypt. His red eyes glowed in the dim light, and the predatory smile that curled at the corners of his lips made Ethan's heart race. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. He clutched the artifact tightly in his hand, feeling its strange, cold energy pulse through him. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Ethan as if trying to gauge his worth. "You've come far," the man said, his voice smooth and calculated. "But knowledge comes with a price, and you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. That artifact you hold? It is no mere trinket. It is the key to awakening something far more dangerous than you can imagine." Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. "I know what it is. I need it to find the vampire queen's bloodline, to stop the vampires from returning." The man laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "Stop them? You think you can stop what's already in motion? The man's eyes flickered with amusement. You've already made the mistake of seeking the truth. But now you must pay the price. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had to act fast. He couldn't let this man, whoever he was, take the artifact from him. But there was something about the way he spoke, the air around him, that suggested the danger wasn't over yet. "What do you want?" Ethan demanded. The man's smile grew wider. "Oh, it's not about what I want. It's about what you want, Ethan. You've crossed into a world where nothing is free. You've uncovered the secrets of the vampires, but you've also uncovered a curse. You've unleashed something far darker than you could have imagined. You see, the vampires were not the only ones hiding in the shadows. There are others, older, more powerful beings who have watched the rise and fall of empires. You have disturbed their rest, and now, you must face them." Ethan felt the air grow thick with an unsettling presence, as if something ancient and powerful was drawing closer. His mind raced, trying to find a way out, but the man seemed to have already anticipated his next move. Before Ethan could react, the stranger raised a hand, and the temperature in the crypt plummeted. The artifact in Ethan's hand grew colder, its energy now almost unbearable. "You have no choice, Ethan," the man said softly, his red eyes burning through the darkness. "You've been chosen, whether you want it or not. The vampires are not the only creatures who seek the return of power. And you're a key player in this game now. But don't worry, you'll learn your place soon enough." The crypt seemed to close in on Ethan, the shadows twisting around him as the man's form faded into the darkness. The only thing left was the pulsing of the artifact in his hand, and the unsettling feeling that the worst was yet to come. Ethan's mind was reeling as he stumbled out of the crypt, his head spinning from the man's words. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just narrowly avoided something far more sinister than vampires. Whoever that man had been, he was right about one thing. Ethan was now involved in something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. As Ethan walked through the streets of Prague, the weight of the artifact in his pocket felt heavier than ever. He couldn't ignore the man's warning. The vampires were only one part of the puzzle. There were other forces at work. Forces that had been hiding in the shadows for centuries, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. Ethan knew he couldn't return to the Brotherhood just yet. They had given him the knowledge, but they hadn't prepared him for what he was facing now. He needed answers, and the only place he could find them was in the heart of the Vampire Queen's bloodline. But the crypts had been only the beginning. If there were others, more powerful beings lurking in the shadows, Ethan was walking into a storm that he wasn't prepared for. He had seen the power the artifact held, but he still didn't understand its full potential. He needed to find out more before it was too late. The first step was clear. He had to find the last descendant of the Vampire Queen, but he could already feel the eyes watching him. Feel the growing presence of something ancient and malevolent that was tracking his every move. Ethan couldn't trust anyone. Not even the Brotherhood. The world he had once thought he understood was slipping away, replaced by something far darker, far more dangerous. And if he wasn't careful, he would become a pawn in a game he didn't even know the rules to. But the Vampire Queen's bloodline was his only hope. He couldn't back down now, not when he was so close. Ethan sat in his hotel room, the city of Prague stretching out before him, its ancient buildings cloaked in the mist of the night. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Every street seemed darker. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret. He had come to find the Vampire Queen's bloodline. But now, the pieces of the puzzle were multiplying, each one leading him deeper into a world of dark forces he wasn't prepared for. He needed to make sense of everything. The crypts, the artifact, the warning from the mysterious man. It was all connected, but how? Ethan turned to the small, intricately carved stone in his hand, the artifact he had taken from the crypt. He had tried to decipher its meaning, but the ancient symbols were foreign to him. The power it radiated was palpable, and though he felt the urge to understand it, Part of him was terrified to do so. The man in the crypt had warned him about it. There were forces beyond the vampires at play here, forces that were too powerful to comprehend. Suddenly, the phone in his pocket buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from Alina, the historian he had met back in Romania. "Ethan, you need to leave Prague. There are people here who know you're searching for the Vampire Queen's bloodline. They know what you found. You're not safe. I've uncovered something that could change everything. Meet me in the old church at midnight. Don't trust anyone." Ethan's blood ran cold. Who was they? Who else knew about his search? And why had Alina warned him? He grabbed his coat and headed out the door, his heart pounding. The old church was on the outskirts of the city, a place steeped in history. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting, but it was also the perfect place for danger. The streets of Prague were quiet as he made his way through the fog, but every step felt heavier, as though the very air was thick with tension. He had no idea who to trust anymore, and every shadow seemed to be hiding an enemy. When he finally reached the church, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, revealing the dimly lit interior. The air inside was cold, and the scent of incense and old stone filled his lungs. There was no sign of Alina. He waited, pacing the creaky floorboards, every minute feeling like an eternity. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, a figure stepped out from the shadows. Alina. But there was something different about her. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she moved cautiously, as though aware of being watched. She didn't speak immediately, her gaze darting nervously around the church. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice low, "I'm glad you came, but you need to listen to me carefully. You've stumbled onto something far bigger than you realize. The Brotherhood, everything you've been told, isn't what it seems. There are others, much older, who have been manipulating things from the shadows. They've known about the Vampire Queen's bloodline for centuries, and they will stop at nothing to control it." Ethan stepped closer, his mind racing. "Who are they? What do you mean? I thought the Brotherhood was the only group protecting the secrets of the vampires." Alina shook her head. "The Brotherhood isn't what they appear to be. They've been guarding secrets, yes, but not for the sake of humanity. The Brotherhood is tied to an even older order, one that serves a far darker purpose. There's a faction within them that has been orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. They knew about the return of the vampires long before you started looking for answers." Ethan's head spun. The Brotherhood, the vampires, the mysterious man. Everything was connected, but it was all a tangled web he couldn't untangle. He had thought he was uncovering the truth, but now it seemed that truth was even more elusive than he had imagined. "Who are these people?" Ethan asked, his voice urgent. "And why are they after the bloodline?" Alina glanced over her shoulder nervously, lowering her voice. "They are a group of ancient sorcerers, the ones who originally created the vampires. They weren't just trying to make creatures of darkness. They were trying to create a new world order, one where they would control both the living and the undead. The Vampire Queen's bloodline is the key to unlocking that power. Whoever controls it, controls everything." Ethan felt a chill wash over him. This was far worse than he had ever imagined. The vampires weren't just trying to rise again. They were part of an ancient conspiracy, one that spanned centuries. "And you think the Brotherhood is involved in this?" Ethan asked, still struggling to process the magnitude of it all. "I'm certain of it," Alina replied. "But there's more. The artifact you found, it's not just a key to the Vampire Queen's bloodline. It's a way to awaken something even older, something that could give the sorcerers the ultimate power. They'll use the bloodline to summon her, and when they do, they'll have control over all vampires, all humans. You can't let them do that." Ethan felt the weight of Alina's words settle in his chest. The journey he had started, his search for the truth about vampires, was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And now, he was in the middle of something far bigger than he could ever have prepared for. "We need to stop them," Ethan said, his voice firm. But how? Alina hesitated, then said, I don't know yet, but I do know one thing. The next few days will decide everything. We need to find the bloodline first. If we can stop them from awakening her, we might have a chance. But even as she spoke, Ethan felt a sense of foreboding. He knew the clock was ticking, and time was running out. The forces he was up against were ancient, powerful, and ruthless, and he had no idea how he was going to stop them. Ethan couldn't sleep. His mind buzzed with Alina's words, the weight of what he had just learned pressing heavily on him. The Brotherhood, the vampires, the sorcerers, all of them had been playing a game with ancient rules, and he was only beginning to understand the stakes. But there was no time to waste. The Vampire Queen's bloodline was the key to everything, and if he didn't find it first, the world as he knew it would be doomed. The next morning, Ethan met with Alina again, this time in a small cafe just outside the city. The fog had lifted, but the city still felt heavy, as though the streets themselves were holding their breath. They sat at a corner table, far from the window, speaking in hushed tones. We need to move quickly, Alina said, her voice tense. The Brotherhood won't give up easily, and if the sorcerers are involved, they'll be just as dangerous. They've been searching for the bloodline for centuries. Whoever controls it controls everything, Ethan. That's why they'll stop at nothing to get their hands on it. Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He had no idea how to find the bloodline, but he knew one thing for sure: the artifact was the key. The question was, how did it work? What was its true power? I think I've figured it out, Ethan said suddenly, his voice full of determination. The artifact is a map. Not just a key to the bloodline, but a map to its location. It's pointing to something specific, a place where the bloodline is hidden. Alina raised an eyebrow. A map? But how can you be sure? Ethan looked at the artifact in his hand, the cold stone now pulsing with a strange energy. He had spent hours staring at the runes, trying to decipher their meaning. And then, it had come to him. A pattern hidden in the symbols, one that pointed to a remote location in the Carpathian Mountains. It was a place that had been mentioned in several vampire legends, but no one had ever dared to investigate it. Until now. It's in the mountains, Ethan continued. There's an ancient temple there, a place lost to time. I believe the bloodline is hidden there, waiting to be found. But we have to move fast. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes. Alina nodded grimly. We don't have much time. If the sorcerers know where it is, they'll be on their way already. And I can't trust anyone else, not even the Brotherhood. They've been lying to us this whole time. Ethan stood up, determination flashing in his eyes. Then we go now. The journey to the Carpathian Mountains was long and treacherous. Ethan and Alina traveled by train, then by car, winding their way through the dense forests and steep hills that led to the remote village near the ancient temple. The further they went, the more isolated they became, the sense of unease growing stronger with each passing mile. As they neared the temple, the air grew colder, and the landscape more desolate. The mountains towered over them like silent sentinels, their peaks shrouded in mist. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the eyes of the past were upon them. The temple was hidden deep within the mountains, a place that had been lost to history for centuries. It was said to be protected by powerful wards, ancient magic that kept intruders at bay. But the closer they got, the more Ethan felt the pull of something powerful, something ancient. The temple was no longer just a place, it was a living entity, and it was calling to him. Ethan and Alina reached the base of the temple as night fell. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the distant howl of wolves echoing through the mountains. The entrance to the temple was covered in vines and overgrown with centuries of neglect. But as they stepped closer, the stone doors began to open on their own, as if inviting them inside. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with faded frescoes depicting scenes from ancient times. The temple was massive, its chambers filled with forgotten relics and carvings that seemed to tell a story of a long-lost civilization. But it wasn't just the artifacts that caught Ethan's attention. It was the altar at the center of the temple, glowing with an otherworldly light. "This is it?" Alina whispered, her voice reverberating in the vast chamber. "The heart of the Vampire Queen's legacy. The bloodline is here." Ethan stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The artifact in his hand began to glow brighter, its runes shifting and changing as if responding to the power of the temple. He placed the stone on the altar, and as he did, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep rumble echoed through the temple, and the air grew heavy with an ancient energy. Ethan and Alina looked at each other, fear and excitement swirling in their chests. "This is it," Ethan said, barely able to contain his excitement. "We've found it." But just as they thought they had succeeded, the temple doors slammed shut with a deafening crash. The room was plunged into darkness, and from the shadows, a voice spoke, cold, venomous, and familiar. "You're too late, Ethan Hale." The room seemed to hold its breath as the last echoes of the mysterious voice faded into the darkness. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the air growing colder with each passing second. Alina's hand gripped his arm tightly, her breath shallow with fear. They had thought they were close to uncovering the truth, but now it seemed like they had walked right into a trap. "You're too late, Ethan Hale," the voice repeated, this time much closer. "The bloodline you seek will never be yours to control." The shadows in the room shifted, and from the darkness, a figure emerged. A tall, cloaked man with eyes that glowed a deep crimson. His face was obscured, but there was no mistaking the aura of power that surrounded him. He was no ordinary vampire. This was something far older, something far more dangerous. Ethan stepped forward, his hand still clutching the artifact. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking but resolute. "What do you want?" The man tilted his head, as if amused by Ethan's defiance. "I am the keeper of the bloodline. I have guarded it for centuries, ensuring that no one has the power to awaken what should remain buried." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "You work for the Brotherhood," he said, piecing together the clues. "You're one of them." The keeper's lips curled into a faint smile. "The Brotherhood is just a small part of something much older, Ethan. You've been playing their game, but you've never understood the true power at play here. The Vampire Queen's bloodline is not just a symbol. It's the key to a new era, one where the vampires rise again, and those who seek to control them will reign supreme." Alina took a step back, fear creeping into her voice. "You're one of the sorcerers, aren't you? You've been controlling everything from the shadows." The keeper's eyes flashed with anger. "You think the Brotherhood is the only force in this game? They are but pawns just like you. The real power lies with the bloodline, and I will not let anyone, human or vampire, stand in the way of its awakening." Ethan clenched his fists, the artifact in his hand pulsing with an intense energy. He knew now that the keeper was not just some servant. He was the master, the one who had been orchestrating the rise of the vampires all along. "You won't win," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We'll stop you. We won't let the vampires return." The keeper laughed softly, the sound reverberating in the chamber. "You can try, but you cannot stop what has already been set in motion. The bloodline is awakening. The queen is rising, and soon, you will understand just how powerless you truly are." Before Ethan could react, the keeper raised his hand, and a wave of dark energy surged toward them. The walls of the temple seemed to crack and groan, as though the very structure was alive. Ethan barely had time to react, but he felt the power of the artifact surge in response, pushing back against the keeper's magic. The artifact in his hand began to glow brighter, and the runes etched into its surface pulsed with a light that seemed to push back the shadows. For a moment, Ethan felt like he was tapping into something ancient, something powerful that he couldn't fully control. "Alina!" Ethan shouted, his voice desperate. We need to stop him now. Alina nodded, her face pale but determined. Together, they focused all their energy on the artifact, trying to harness its power. The Keeper snarled, his crimson eyes burning with fury. But the light from the artifact continued to grow, shining brighter than before. You think this trinket can stop me? The Keeper's voice grew darker, filled with malice. You are nothing but a fool. But just as the Keeper stepped forward to strike, the artifact's light flared, and with a burst of energy, it sent the Keeper stumbling backward. The temple shook violently, as though the very foundations of the earth were being torn apart. The Keeper's expression twisted with rage, and for a moment, Ethan thought they had won. But then, the darkness seemed to grow even thicker, and from the shadows, more figures emerged. The vampires, dozens of them, crawled from the hidden recesses of the temple, their eyes glowing red, their fangs bared. More of them, Alina whispered, her voice filled with dread. We can't fight them all. Ethan gritted his teeth. We don't have a choice. The temple was now swarming with vampires, each one moving faster than the last. The Keeper's spell had awakened them, and they were coming for them. Ethan and Alina backed toward the altar, the artifact still glowing brightly, but they were outnumbered. The vampires circled them, their eyes fixated on the artifact, sensing its power. Just as the vampires lunged, the temple doors exploded open with a deafening crash, and a blinding light filled the room. Ethan and Alina shielded their eyes as the light intensified, pushing back the vampires and the Keeper alike. In the doorway stood a figure, tall, powerful, and regal, the vampire queen herself. The temple was engulfed in blinding light as the figure in the doorway stepped forward, casting a long shadow across the stone floor. The vampires around them hissed and recoiled, their eyes narrowing at the figure, as if recognizing something far more powerful than themselves. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he finally saw her, the vampire queen. She stood tall and regal, her features sharp and ethereal. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural red hue, and her presence radiated an ancient, terrifying power. For a moment, the very air seemed to shift around her, the oppressive darkness of the temple lifting as though she were the source of the light itself. The Keeper, still reeling from the blast of energy from the artifact, straightened and stared at her with a mix of awe and fear. You, he whispered, his voice trembling. You shouldn't be here. The vampire queen's lips curled into a smile, but it was not a comforting sight. Her gaze swept over Ethan and Alina, and then fixed on the Keeper. I was always here, Keeper, she said, her voice low and commanding, carrying an ancient power. You and your sorcerers thought you could control my bloodline, my legacy, but you were wrong. The time has come for me to reclaim what was always mine. Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. The vampire queen, the one whose bloodline held the key to the vampire race's power, was alive, and she was here, in the heart of the temple. The force that had once created and ruled over vampires was back, and all the history he had studied, all the research he had done, was leading to this moment. Alina's voice was barely a whisper as she spoke to Ethan. She's the one we've been searching for. The bloodline is hers. Ethan's mind raced. He had to stop her. He couldn't let her gain control over the vampires, not when it would mean the end of humanity's reign. But with every passing second, it felt as though they were growing more powerless in the face of her immense power. The queen raised her hand, and the vampires surrounding them knelt, bowing to her in reverence. You are too late, Ethan Hale, she said, her eyes locking with his. Your attempts to stop me have only hastened my return. The world will bend to my will once again. The age of humanity is over. Ethan's grip tightened on the artifact. He knew that he couldn't defeat her with brute force alone. The vampires, the Keeper, and now the vampire queen were part of something far more ancient and powerful than anything he had encountered. But he had to try. He had to stop her before it was too late. You're wrong, Ethan said, his voice steady, though he felt his heart racing. The world won't bend to you. We still have a chance. The artifact is the key to ending this. We can stop you. The Queen's lips parted in a mocking smile. You truly think that trinket can stop me? She scoffed. It is a relic, nothing more. It cannot contain the power I possess. Ethan's mind raced as he looked at the artifact in his hand. It had given him strength before. Maybe it could give him strength again. But what was the key to unlocking its full power? Was there a way to use it to stop her? Before he could act, the Keeper, his eyes burning with fury, raised his hands and summoned a wave of dark energy, hurling it toward Ethan and Alina. The force of the blast was enough to knock them both off their feet, sending them crashing into the stone walls of the temple. The vampires roared in anger, and the Vampire Queen raised her hand, stopping them. She turned toward the Keeper, her eyes glowing with disdain. Enough, she commanded. We will not waste our strength on these fools. Ethan struggled to rise, his head spinning from the force of the blast. The artifact in his hand was still glowing faintly, but its light seemed to dim in the presence of the Queen's power. He glanced at Alina, who was slowly getting to her feet as well. The situation was growing more dire by the second. They had no choice but to fight back, somehow. The Queen slowly walked toward them, her eyes locked on Ethan. You have no idea what you're dealing with, human. You cannot stand against me. But then, as she stepped forward, the ground beneath them trembled once more. The air shifted again, and the stone walls seemed to crack. The light from the artifact flared brightly, casting a dazzling glow that pushed back the darkness. Suddenly, the Keeper's face twisted with anger. No, he shouted, reaching toward the Queen. This cannot be. The artifact pulsed with a newfound intensity, and Ethan could feel the power building within it, as though it were responding to the Queen's very presence. It was almost as if the artifact was meant to oppose her, to stop her from fulfilling her ancient reign. Without thinking, Ethan raised the artifact, its light now blinding. You may be ancient, but you're not invincible, he said, his voice trembling but determined. As the artifact's light grew brighter, the Queen's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing with recognition. You don't understand what you're doing, she hissed. That artifact is... Before she could finish her sentence, the light from the artifact exploded, enveloping the Queen in a surge of energy that sent her stumbling backward. Her scream echoed through the temple as the force of the energy pushed her into the altar. The vampires around them shrieked in agony, their forms dissolving into the shadows as the power from the artifact overwhelmed them. The Keeper, too, seemed to falter, his dark magic flickering as the light from the artifact burned through his protective spells. The temple trembled again, but this time, it wasn't from the Queen's power. It was as if the very foundation of the place was crumbling, reacting to the artifact's energy. The temple shook violently as the intense light from the artifact bathed the Queen in its blinding glow. Her scream reverberated through the stone walls, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The air crackled with energy, and the vampires that had once surrounded them now fled in panic, their bodies dissolving into shadows as the light from the artifact consumed them. Ethan stood at the center of the chaos, the artifact still glowing fiercely in his hand. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling from the sheer force of the energy he had unleashed. But as the dust began to settle and the light from the artifact dimmed, a chilling silence fell over the temple. The Vampire Queen, though weakened, slowly rose to her feet, her eyes now burning with fury. She was no longer the regal, untouchable queen she had once been. The light from the artifact had shattered her power, leaving her vulnerable. But the rage in her eyes was undeniable. You fool! She spat, her voice venomous. Do you think this will stop me? You have no idea what you've just unleashed. Ethan tightened his grip on the artifact, still pulsing with energy. His head spun from the exertion, But he knew this wasn't over yet. He had managed to weaken her, but the Vampire Queen was ancient. Her power wasn't easily destroyed. "You're not going to win," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the terror gnawing at his insides. "You can't control this power. It's too much for you." The Queen's lips twisted into a cold smile. "Control?" she scoffed. "I have never sought control. I am power incarnate. I am the dawn of a new era." The ground beneath them trembled again, and Ethan could feel the weight of her words. Despite the damage he had caused, the Vampire Queen was still a force to be reckoned with. But Ethan wasn't about to give up. He had to end this now before the Queen could regain her strength. "Alina!" Ethan shouted, turning toward her. "We need to finish this. She's too powerful for us to fight alone." Alina nodded, her face pale but determined. She stepped forward, her hands raised as though preparing to unleash some kind of magic. "Ethan, we've been given this chance, but we have to act quickly. She's already recovering." The Queen snarled, sensing the danger in their actions. "You think you can defeat me with your feeble attempts at magic?" she mocked. "I have lived for centuries, and you, mere mortals, think you can stop me?" But just as she spoke, the walls of the temple began to crack, a deep rumble echoing through the chamber. The artifact in Ethan's hand pulsed once more, and the light from it surged again, stronger this time, fueled by a newfound purpose. The Vampire Queen's eyes widened in fear as she backed away. "No," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "This cannot be. The legacy." But it was too late. The artifact's light exploded outward, engulfing the entire temple in its brilliance. The force of the explosion sent the Queen flying back, crashing into the altar with a deafening roar. The vampires who had been hiding in the shadows, waiting for her command, vanished in a cloud of smoke. Ethan and Alina shielded their eyes, the light so intense that it seemed to burn the very air around them. When the light finally dimmed, the temple fell silent. Ethan lowered the artifact, his body trembling from the strain. The temple was in ruins, the walls crumbled, and the once mighty Vampire Queen lay motionless, her body charred and broken. Her once glowing eyes were now lifeless, and the power that had radiated from her was gone. Alina took a step forward, her voice soft. "Did we do it? Is it over?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. He had stopped the Vampire Queen, but at what cost? The temple was destroyed. The artifact's power had nearly consumed him, and he had no idea what the future held now. I think we've stopped her," Ethan said finally, though his voice was uncertain. "But I'm not sure if this is the end. There are still forces out there, waiting for the right moment." Alina nodded, looking around the ruined temple. The Brotherhood, the sorcerers, they were only part of something much bigger. And now, with the Queen defeated, we've created a void, a power vacuum that others will try to fill. Ethan looked at her, his eyes dark with realization. "So this isn't over," he said quietly. "Not yet." As they left the ruins of the temple, the sun began to rise over the Carpathian Mountains, casting a pale light over the destruction left behind. The world felt different now, as if something had shifted, something that could never be undone. Ethan and Alina made their way back to the nearest town, weary from their battle, but knowing that their fight wasn't truly finished. They had stopped the Vampire Queen, but there were still many unanswered questions. The artifact, the ancient order, and the dark forces they had uncovered all hinted at a much larger conflict still to come. Ethan felt the weight of the artifact in his pocket, a constant reminder of the power he had wielded, and the responsibility it carried. He knew now that the world was not what it seemed. There were more ancient forces at play, and the Vampire Queen's return had been only the beginning. As they reached the edge of the village, Alina turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Ethan, what now? Where do we go from here?" Ethan took a deep breath, looking out over the horizon. We keep going. We find the truth. We stop whatever is coming next. And we make sure the world never forgets what we've learned. Alina nodded, her eyes filled with resolve. Then let's get started. The village was quiet, the remnants of the night still lingering in the early morning air. Ethan and Alina had barely spoken since leaving the ruins of the temple. Their minds were consumed with the enormity of what had just transpired. The vampire queen was defeated, but the world had changed. Things could never go back to the way they were. As they made their way through the quiet streets of the village, Ethan felt the weight of the artifact in his pocket. It was no longer just a relic. It was a symbol of the battle they had won, and the battle's still ahead. He knew that, in the grand scheme of things, this was only a small victory. There were far larger forces at play, forces that sought to fill the void left by the Queen's defeat. "We've bought ourselves some time," Alina said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "But we both know this isn't the end. The Brotherhood, the sorcerers, they're still out there." Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. "I know, the Queen may be gone, but the legacy she left behind is still very much alive. And now we've made ourselves targets. We've uncovered something, Alina, something far bigger than we could have imagined." Alina stopped walking and turned to face him. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The Queen, the artifact, the ancient order, they're all connected. The vampires weren't just created to rule. They were meant to serve a purpose. The power they sought wasn't just about domination. It was about control over something much older. Something that the sorcerers, the Brotherhood, and the vampires have been guarding for centuries. Alina's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, something older?" "I don't know yet," Ethan admitted, "but I believe it's connected to the very origins of vampires themselves. The power that created them is something far more dangerous than anything we've seen so far. And if it falls into the wrong hands, then we're in more trouble than we've ever imagined." Alina finished, her voice grim. Ethan looked around at the quiet village, his mind racing. "The artifact is the key. We need to figure out how to control its power before anyone else does. The Brotherhood is already aware of its significance. And if the sorcerers are still active, we're going to need more than just the artifact to survive." Alina nodded. "So, what do we do now?" "We need to go to the source," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We need to find out where this power comes from, and how we can stop it from falling into the wrong hands." Their journey took them back to the heart of Eastern Europe, to the ancient cities and forgotten crypts that had once been home to the vampire legends. This time, they were not just searching for answers about vampires. They were searching for the origin of the power that had sustained them for so long. The days passed in a blur as they visited hidden libraries, ancient tombs, and secret archives, piecing together the fragments of history that had been hidden for centuries. The artifact had led them to a series of ancient texts, written in languages that no one alive could understand. But with each discovery, they drew closer to the truth. One night, as they sat in a dusty, forgotten library beneath the ruins of an old castle, Alina spoke up. "I found something," she said, her voice low, "a reference to a ritual, one that could unlock the full power of the artifact." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of ritual?" "It's an ancient rite," Alina explained, showing him the text she had uncovered. "It's said to be the key to summoning the original power, the one that created vampires in the first place. If the ritual is completed, the one who performs it will gain control over not just the vampires, but the very essence of immortality." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. If that's true, then the sorcerers aren't just trying to control the vampires. They're trying to control the very source of their power. Alina nodded. "And if they succeed, they'll have the power to reshape the world, to bend it to their will." Ethan clenched his fists, the weight of their mission now more pressing than ever. "We have to stop them. We can't let the ritual happen. but we need to know where it's being performed and how to stop it. The next clue came to them from an unexpected source. An old map, drawn centuries ago, showing the location of a hidden temple deep within the mountains of Transylvania. The map pointed to a place called the Heart of the Dark, a place that had been abandoned for centuries. The temple was rumored to be where the original ritual had been performed. "We have to go there," Ethan said, determination flashing in his eyes. "It's the only place that could hold the answers we need. And if the sorcerers are still using it, we have to destroy it." The journey to the temple was treacherous. As they ventured deeper into the mountains, the landscape became more desolate, the air colder, and the silence more oppressive. The Heart of the Dark was hidden in the deepest part of the mountain range, surrounded by dense forests and jagged cliffs. No one had dared to go near it for centuries. As they approached the temple, the atmosphere grew heavier, the very air tingling with an unnatural energy. The temple itself was carved into the side of a mountain, its entrance hidden behind ancient stone doors, covered in runes that no one had been able to decipher. But as Ethan and Alina stood before it, they both felt the same sense of foreboding, the feeling that something terrible was waiting for them inside. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Ethan placed his hand on the stone door, the runes glowing faintly under his touch. The artifact in his pocket pulsed once more, as if acknowledging the power that lay beyond the door. With a deep breath, he pushed against the stone, and the door groaned open, revealing the dark passage beyond. The temple was ancient, its walls covered in strange symbols and carvings. The air inside was thick with dust, and the only sound was their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. They moved cautiously, knowing that whatever lay ahead could be their final confrontation. At the heart of the temple, they found what they had been searching for: an altar, bathed in an eerie, otherworldly light. The ritual had already begun. The altar at the center of the temple radiated a dark, foreboding energy. Ethan and Alina stood at the entrance of the chamber, their eyes locked on the ritual that was unfolding before them. Shadows danced across the walls, flickering and shifting in the dim light. The air was thick with the stench of ancient magic, an energy that seemed to hum with power. At the altar stood a cloaked figure, chanting in a language older than time. Behind him, the stone walls were covered in ancient runes, glowing with an eerie light as the ritual began to reach its climax. The figure was not alone. Around the altar stood several others, members of the Brotherhood, the sorcerers, each one with their hands raised, as if feeding their power into the ritual. "You found us?" the cloaked figure said, his voice cold and hollow. "But it's too late. The ritual is almost complete. The bloodline will awaken, and nothing will stop us." Ethan and Alina exchanged a glance. The power in the room was suffocating, and the dark magic was palpable. This was it, the final battle, where the very fate of the world rested on their shoulders. The artifact in Ethan's pocket pulsed again, as though urging them forward. "We can stop this," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. "We've come too far to back down now." Alina nodded. "We have to break the ritual. If we don't, everything we've fought for will be lost." With a deep breath, Ethan stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the cloaked figure. "Stop the ritual," he shouted. "It's over. We won't let you control the power any longer." The cloaked figure smiled darkly. "You think you can stop this? You cannot. The power of the bloodline is too great. You are nothing but pawns, trying to play a game far beyond your understanding." Ethan's hand tightened around the artifact, and he raised it toward the altar. The light from the artifact flared, shining brightly in the dark chamber. For a brief moment, the chanting stopped, and the room went silent. But then, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath them shook, and the air grew colder. A deafening roar filled the temple, as though the very walls were alive with fury. From the altar, a figure began to rise. a figure that Ethan had only heard about in legends, one that he never believed could truly exist. The Vampire Queen, revived by the ritual, slowly emerged from the altar, her eyes glowing red with an unholy fire. Her form was more powerful than before, her presence overwhelming. The sorcerers who had been chanting fell to their knees, their faces twisted with awe and fear. "No!" Ethan whispered, his heart sinking. She's alive." The Queen's lips parted in a cruel smile. "Did you truly think you could stop me, Ethan Hale? You have unleashed me, brought me back to life, and now you will pay the price." The room erupted in chaos as the Queen raised her hands, sending waves of dark magic surging through the chamber. The sorcerers, now under her complete control, gathered around her, ready to carry out her command. But Ethan and Alina weren't ready to give up. With a surge of energy, Ethan raised the artifact one last time, the light glowing brighter than ever. "We're not finished yet," he shouted, pushing all his remaining strength into the artifact. The artifact responded, a burst of light emanating from it that collided with the Queen's dark power. The shockwave from the clash of forces sent the sorcerers flying, and the Vampire Queen staggered, her form flickering as if the light from the artifact was destabilizing her existence. "You cannot control me," the Queen hissed, her voice full of rage. "I am eternal. I am the darkness." But as her form trembled, Ethan saw something, a flicker of vulnerability. The artifact, glowing with unimaginable energy, seemed to draw the Queen's power into itself, as though it were siphoning it away. "Alina!" Ethan shouted. "Now! We need to finish this!" Alina, her eyes wide with realization, stepped forward, focusing all her magic into the light from the artifact. Together, they aimed their combined force at the Queen, who screamed in fury, but it was too late. The light from the artifact surged, and the Queen's form dissolved into shadows, her scream echoing through the temple as the darkness around her faded. The sorcerers, too, were consumed by the light, their bodies disintegrating into nothingness. The temple fell silent once more, the echoes of their power dissipating into the air. Ethan and Alina stood in the ruins, breathless and trembling, as the dust settled around them. The power was gone, but even as the temple crumbled, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The battle had been won, but the conflict was far from over. The Queen might have been defeated, but the forces she had left behind, the sorcerers, the ancient power, still lingered, like a shadow that had only been temporarily banished. "We did it," Alina said, her voice tired but resolute. Ethan nodded, though his heart was heavy. "This was just the beginning. We've stopped the Queen, but there are still so many unanswered questions. The forces we've uncovered, they're not gone. They're waiting." As they made their way out of the temple, Ethan glanced over his shoulder at the ruin that had once been the source of such dark power. The world outside seemed unchanged, but Ethan knew that nothing would ever be the same. "You're right," Alina said, following his gaze. "We've stopped them for now, but this isn't over. There will always be someone else, someone who wants that power." Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with determination. "Then we'll stop them too, no matter what it takes." As they walked into the dawn of a new day, the sun's first rays shining through the trees, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning of something much larger. The war was far from over, but he had found the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The forces of darkness would rise again, but so would the light.